Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that might make your grandmother blush and your history teacher shuffle uncomfortably. We're talking about sex in the Middle Ages, not the sanitized version you learned in school, not the romanticized fairy tale nonsense from Hollywood, but the real, messy, surprisingly sophisticated truth about what actually happened between the sheets when people wore chainmail to work and thought bathing was optional. So before we get comfortable with some very uncomfortable truths, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy having your assumptions about history completely destroyed. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world to bedroom habits. Now learn about medieval dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey through the surprisingly complex world of medieval sexuality. Picture this. You're living in the year 1300, and contrary to what you might think, you're not some sexually repressed peasant stumbling around in the dark. Medieval people weren't the backward, prudish primitives we imagine them to be. They were navigating an intricate web of religious doctrine, medical theory, and social expectations that would make modern dating apps look simple. These weren't people who thought sex was dirty or sinful in the way we assume. They were dealing with a world where doctors literally prescribed masturbation as medical treatment, where the church regulated not just when you could have sex, but exactly how you could do it, and where your local priest might quietly look the other way if you were sleeping with your boyfriend before marriage. The truth is, medieval attitudes towards sex were far more nuanced and sophisticated than the stereotypes suggest. While Christian ideals certainly influenced how people thought about sexuality, the reality was a complex interaction between religious teaching, medical understanding, and the simple fact that humans are humans, regardless of what century they live in. Medieval physicians understood sexual health in ways that might surprise you. They recognized that sexual activity wasn't just pleasurable, it was medically necessary for most adults. They feared death by celibacy as much as venereal disease, and they developed complex sexual health regimens that acknowledged the body's needs. Let's start with what medieval doctors actually believed about sex and health, because this is where things get really interesting. Medieval medical theory held that sexual activity was essential for maintaining physical and mental well-being. For women especially, physicians believed that a lack of sexual activity could literally be fatal. In a woman who wasn't sexually active, they thought, seed would be retained within her body, and as it built up, it would cause what they called suffocation of the womb. The symptoms included fainting, shortness of breath, and in the most serious cases, death. This wasn't superstition. This was established medical doctrine based on centuries of observation and the inherited wisdom of Greek and Roman physicians. The recommended treatment for this condition was obvious. Get married and have regular church-sanctioned intercourse with your spouse. But here's where it gets fascinating. If marriage wasn't possible, medieval physicians had a range of alternative diets, vin remedies, restrictable treatments, and yes, mastigar suppositories, herbation. Some physicians actually recommended that women's stimnatals ulate their own GE do it for them, or have a medical professional as a legitimate medical treatment. This was particularly recommended for women suffering the womb. The medical establishment recognized from suffocation OFD that sexual release was Arabe treatments that might seem they were willing to press a remarkably progressive health necessity, and even by men, the today's standards. For medical understanding was similar. Retained seed was believed to cause a host of physical and mental ailments. The buildup of sexual fluids was thought to lead to illness, depression, and even death. Medieval physicians inherited this understanding from ancient Greek medicine, particularly the works of Galen, who had recommended regular sexual activity or masturbation as preventive medicine. This created an interesting tension between medical necessity and religious doctrine that medieval society had to navigate carefully. But let's talk about what the church actually said about all this, because the reality is far more complicated than you might expect. The medieval church did indeed have strong opinions about sex, but those opinions weren't simply, sex is bad and you shouldn't do it. Instead, the church developed an incredibly detailed regulatory framework that governed every aspect of sexual behavior for married couples. They didn't forbid sex, they micromanaged it. The church's regulation of marital sex was extraordinarily comprehensive. Married couples were forbidden from having sexual relations on Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays. They couldn't have sex on any feast days or fast days. They had to abstain during Lent, during Advent, and during numerous other religious observances throughout the year. They couldn't have sex when the woman was menstruating, when she was breastfeeding, or for 40 days after childbirth. When you add up all these restrictions, the average married couple could legally have sex less than once a week. Some historians have calculated that these restrictions left couples with only about 100 days per year when sexual activity was permissible. That's roughly 3 days per week, and only if none of those days happened to fall on a religious holiday, during a fasting period, or during one of the many other prohibited times. According to some calculations, sexual activity was restricted to only Mondays, Tuesdays, and certain Wednesdays that weren't holy days or fasts, leaving all other days completely off limits. But here's the thing, most historians doubt that these rules were actually followed by the majority of the population. The church could make all the rules it wanted, but enforcing them in the privacy of people's bedrooms was another matter entirely. By the 12th century, even the church itself began to show a more permissive attitude, recognizing that their restrictions were perhaps unrealistic. Rather than absolute commands, observance of these sexual restrictions became more like guidelines that good Christians should try to follow if possible. The church also had very specific ideas about how married couples should have sex when. Only the missionary position was considered completely acceptable and natural. They were allowed to do itable at best, and potentially mortally sinful at worst. Third, as morally question. Any other sexual position was great medieval theologian Albertus Magnus ranked sexual positions in order of most to least natural. Missionary position was at the top, followed by side, seated, standing, and finally from behind. While he considered missionary position the only completely natural option, he deemed the others morally questionable, but not necessarily damning to your eternal soul. The reasoning behind these restrictions reveals a lot about medieval thinking. Having the woman on top was considered unnatural because it reversed what they saw as the proper order of male and female sexuality. It put the woman in the superior or active role that was normally reserved for men. Sex from behind was considered beastly because it supposedly confused the boundaries between human and animal behavior. The missionary position was favored not only because it seemed to symbolize man's superiority over woman, but because it was believed to favor conception and thus fulfill the procreative purpose that the church saw as the only legitimate reason for sexual activity. However, even here there were exceptions and complications. Some progressive theologians began to allow deviations from the standard position, particularly in cases involving physical limitations like extreme obesity or disability. The church's desire to control even the most intimate aspects of married life was clear, but practical considerations sometimes forced them to make accommodations. When it came to masturbation, medieval attitudes were predictably complex and contradictory. The church generally considered masturbation immoral, but the severity of this sin was debated. Most medieval penitentials, the handbooks that priests used to assign punishments for sins, identified masturbation as requiring penance. The typical punishment was around 30 days of fasting, though some sources prescribed as much as 2 years of penance for repeat offenders. Interestingly, masturbation was usually placed toward the bottom of the hierarchy of sexual sins. It was considered less serious than adultery, rape, or even visiting a prostitute. In fact, many medieval authorities considered it less immoral for a man to visit a sex worker than to masturbate, because sex with a prostitute could theoretically still result in procreation, while masturbation was purely for pleasure. confessors were permitted to make allowances for those who lacked another outlet for their desires, particularly unmarried young men. The 7th century Irish Penitential of Cummian banned oral sex, anal sex, and masturbation, but with varying degrees of severity. Another early work, the Penitential Theodori, specified punishments for different sexual acts. If a man masturbated, he was to abstain from meat for 4 days. If he attempted to masturbate but was unable to climax, the penance was 40 days of fasting, or 20 days for a lighter punishment. These detailed prescriptions show how seriously the Church took sexual regulation, but they also reveal that these behaviours were common enough to require specific guidelines for confessors. Despite these religious prohibitions, the Church's awareness of contemporary medical teachings created a pragmatic approach that sometimes permitted what was theoretically forbidden. The medical establishment's insistence that sexual release was necessary for health put Church authorities in a difficult position. They couldn't simply ignore centuries of medical wisdom, especially when that wisdom was based on respected ancient sources like Galen. This created a tension between doctrine and practical health concerns that individual confessors had to navigate on a case-by-case basis. Late medieval medical texts rarely mentioned male masturbation explicitly, perhaps because of this religious sensitivity, but the understanding that sexual release was medically necessary remained. For women, the situation was even more complex, since female masturbation was sometimes explicitly recommended as medical treatment for suffocation of the womb. A woman suffering from this condition might be prescribed stimulation of her genitals, either by herself or by a medical professional, creating a situation where what was sinful in a religious context became therapeutic in a medical one. This brings us to one of the most surprising aspects of medieval sexuality, the gap between official doctrine and actual practice. While the Church preached about the importance of virginity until marriage and sexual restraint within marriage, the reality of medieval life was quite different. Premarital sex was surprisingly common, despite official condemnation. In fact, many ordinary people didn't believe that fornication was a sin at all, and were often surprised when priests informed them during confession that they had indeed sinned by engaging in premarital sexual activity. Saint Vincent Ferrer, writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, claimed that by age 15, all young men had lost their virginity. While this might be an exaggeration, it suggests that premarital sexual activity was widespread and generally accepted, at least among the male population. For couples who were betrothed, sleeping together during an engagement period was common practice. This served as a sort of trial period before the wedding, allowing couples to determine if they were sexually compatible before making their final commitment. If the sexual relationship didn't work out during this trial period, couples might attempt to release themselves from their engagement, sometimes by becoming godparents to the same child, which would create a spiritual relationship that would make marriage impossible under Church law. This system gave couples a practical way to test their compatibility while maintaining some connection to religious and social expectations. Much popular medieval literature mocked the supposed moral laxity of the lower and middle classes, particularly the peasantry, suggesting that premarital sexual activity was considered amusing rather than shocking. Local parish priests were usually quietly accepting of these arrangements, often advising couples to keep their activities secret from Church authorities, but not demanding that they stop. The Middle Ages were a very broad period in terms of both time and location, and customs could vary significantly, but it was generally an accepted fact of life that quite a few people were going to have premarital sex, regardless of what the Church officially taught. This practical acceptance extended to the definition of marriage itself. In many communities, you could be considered married if you loved someone, slept with them, and spoke vows to each other, not necessarily in that order. The legal validity of such arrangements was often difficult to prove, and there are numerous court cases of women suing to establish that they were legally married to men who later tried to claim the relationship had never been formalized. But the fact that such cases existed shows that informal marriage arrangements were common and socially recognized, even if they weren't always legally protected. The gap between official religious doctrine and lived experience was substantial throughout the medieval period. While the Church preached about sexual restraint and the importance of following detailed regulations about when and how married couples could have sex, the reality was that most people found ways to accommodate both their religious beliefs and their human desires. This created a complex landscape where individuals had to navigate between official expectations and practical necessities, often with the quiet understanding and support of their local religious authorities. Medieval marriage practices were far more complex and varied than our modern fairy tale notions suggest. Among the wealthy and noble classes, courtship was rarely about romance or personal attraction. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated business negotiation designed to increase family power, forge political alliances, or consolidate wealth. Young people often wouldn't meet their future spouses until after the marriage had already been arranged by their parents. And even when they did meet beforehand, their interactions were heavily monitored and controlled by family members. The age at which people could legally marry was surprisingly young by today's standards. Marriage was considered acceptable as soon as puberty began, which meant girls could be married from around age 12 and boys from 14. Betrothals were sometimes arranged when children were even younger, with the actual wedding ceremony taking place years later when they reached the minimum age. These early arrangements were particularly common among the nobility, where strategic alliances needed to be secured well in advance. For the upper classes, love was considered irrelevant to marriage, and marrying purely for romantic reasons was seen as foolish and potentially disastrous for family interests. Parents viewed their children's marriages as investments in the family's future, and they expected their offspring to understand and accept this responsibility. The bride and groom often had little or no say in the choice of their partner, and refusing an arranged marriage could result in disinheritance or other severe family consequences. However, the situation was quite different among the lower classes. Since peasants and labourers had little property to exchange and few political alliances to consider, they were free to marry for love and personal compatibility. Ironically, this meant that the poorest members of society often had more romantic freedom than the wealthiest. Many peasants never formally married at all, since there was little economic benefit to a legal ceremony, and the costs associated with a church wedding were often prohibitive. The evolution of marriage practices throughout the medieval period is fascinating to trace. In the early Middle Ages, marriage was largely a secular contract between families, with minimal church involvement. The ceremony itself might be as simple as the couple exchanging vows in front of witnesses, followed by the physical consummation of the relationship. The Church gradually increased its involvement in marriage over the centuries, eventually making it one of the 7 sacraments and requiring religious ceremonies for validity. By the late Middle Ages, there was a noticeable shift toward individual consent and personal choice in marriage. The idea of companionate marriage, where spouses were expected to be friends and partners as well as economic allies, began to gain acceptance. Young people were increasingly allowed to veto unwanted arranged matches, and parents began to consider their children's preferences alongside practical considerations. This transformation reflected broader social changes and the growing influence of romantic literature and courtly love traditions. The institution of concubinage provided an interesting alternative to marriage for men who couldn't or wouldn't marry. Concubinage was legally recognized and socially acceptable throughout much of the medieval period, creating a middle ground between marriage and casual sexual relationships. A concubine was more than a mistress, but less than a wife, and these relationships were often long-term and stable arrangements that provided security for both parties involved. The practice of concubinage was particularly common among the clergy before the church reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries. It wasn't until the ecumenical councils of 1123 and 1139 that priests and monks were legally forbidden to marry or keep concubines. Before these reforms, many clergy lived openly with women in what were essentially marital relationships. and these arrangements were generally accepted by their communities. Concubinage also served an important function within noble families due to inheritance laws and family structure. In many cases, only the oldest son and perhaps one other male heir were allowed to marry and produce legitimate children. This left many younger sons without the possibility of legal marriage, since they lacked the resources to support a family, or the inheritance rights that would make them attractive marriage partners. Rather than remain celibate, many of these men entered into concubinage arrangements. These relationships weren't hidden or shameful. Many lesser noble women served as concubines to higher nobility or royalty and were treated with considerable respect by society. Some were already married, with husbands who not only accepted, but sometimes encouraged these arrangements for the political and economic advantages they provided. Others were unmarried when they became concubines, but were still able to make good marriages later, suggesting that the social stigma associated with concubinage was minimal. The children born from these relationships occupied a complex legal and social position. While they weren't legitimate heirs in the traditional sense, they were often acknowledged by their fathers and provided with education, property, or positions within the household. Some illegitimate children of noble fathers rose to positions of considerable power and influence, demonstrating that birth outside of marriage wasn't necessarily a barrier to social advancement. Medieval contraception practices reveal a sophisticated understanding of reproductive biology that challenges assumptions about medieval ignorance. The most common and easily concealed method was coitus interruptus, or withdrawal before ejaculation. This practice, sometimes called onanism after the biblical story of Onan, was clearly distinguished from masturbation and was viewed primarily as a form of contraception rather than a sexual sin. Women employed various barrier methods, including cloth inserts soaked in honey or vinegar that were placed in the vagina before intercourse. The use of honey as a contraceptive can be traced back to ancient Egyptian practices, and it may have been surprisingly effective due to its thick consistency, which would impede sperm movement, and its natural acidity. Vinegar was also used for its acidic properties, which could create an inhospitable environment for sperm. Plant-based contraceptives were widely used throughout the medieval period, though much of this knowledge has been lost over time. Medieval medical texts often included lists of herbal preparations designed to hurry the menses or cleanse the womb, euphemistic language that disguised their contraceptive and abortive properties. These preparations typically included combinations of herbs such as pennyroyal, rue, parsley, Queen Anne's lace, artemisia, and various other plants with documented anti-fertility properties. Modern scientific research has confirmed that many of these medieval contraceptive herbs do indeed have biological effects on fertility. Queen Anne's lace, for example, has been shown to have postnatal anti-fertility properties and is still used for birth control in some parts of the world today. Pennyroyal, parsley, and rue are so effective that modern women are advised to avoid them during pregnancy. The medieval understanding of these plants' properties suggests a sophisticated tradition of women's reproductive knowledge that was passed down through generations. The knowledge of herbal contraception was primarily maintained by women and wives, transmitted through informal networks of mayas and experienced mothers. This created a parallel system of reproductive healthcare that existed alongside official medicine, but remained largely hidden from male physicians and church authorities. The secrecy surrounding these practices may explain why they're often absent from formal medical texts, even though archaeological and documentary evidence suggests they were widely used. Some medieval communities also employed magical and ritualistic methods for birth control, reflecting the integration of folk beliefs with practical approaches to fertility control. German women, for example, had various magical methods they believed would prevent pregnancy, including sitting or lying on a specific number of fingers, corresponding to the number of years they wished to remain childless, spitting into the mouth of a frog 3 times, or performing rituals at the graves of deceased sisters, disturbing magical practices. More receptive uses as contrad animals or human fet included using parts of deer amulets. These objects might contain dried herbs alongside beaver testicles, mule earwax, bones from black cats, or other animal parts believed to provide magical protection against pregnancy. While these practices seem bizarre to modern observers, they demonstrate the lengths to which some women would go to control their fertility, and the creative approaches medieval people developed when scientific methods were limited. Birth worn by women who control amulets were commonly wanted to prevent pregnancy, and they typically combined practical herbal elements with magical components. The fact that such amulets existed and were apparently widely used suggests that the desire to control fertility was strong enough to overcome religious prohibitions and social expectations about women's reproductive roles. Breastfeeding was widely recognized as a natural form of contraception and was strategically employed by families for spacing births, understood that nursing act. Medieval parents D as a natural contraceptive, and they used this knowledge for family planning purposes. Breastfeeding of extends up to 3 years was common, and this practice served multiple functions beyond child nutrition. The contra of breastfeeding was so well receptive effect around wet nursing, social practices understood that it influenced wealthy families, often hired wet nurses specifically to allow the mother to become pregnant again more quickly, while pod breastfeeding Asura families would extend a means of naturally spacing their children. This reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between lactation and fertility, with different social classes using this knowledge according to their circumstances and desires. The practice of extended breastfeeding also gave the mother's body time to recover from childbirth, reducing the health risks associated with closely spaced pregnancies. Medieval women understood that frequent pregnancies could be dangerous and debilitating, and they used every available method to control their fertility and protect their health. The combination of breast approach to family feeding with other contraceptive methods created a comprehensive, easily acceptable planning that was both practical and okay. The sophistication of medieval approaches to fertility control becomes even more apparent when we examine their understanding of timing and fertility cycles. Medieval women possessed detailed knowledge about their menstrual cycles and fertile periods, information that was passed down through generations of mothers, midwives, and female healers. They understood that certain times of the month were more likely to result in pregnancy, and they used this knowledge to either encourage or avoid conception depending on their circumstances. Medieval medical texts often discuss the relationship between menstruation and fertility, though the explanations were sometimes based on incomplete understanding of reproductive biology. Physicians believed that women were most fertile immediately after their menstrual period ended, which isn't entirely accurate by modern standards, but it shows that they were actively trying to understand and predict fertility. This knowledge was combined with other methods to create comprehensive approaches to family planning that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. The timing of sexual activity was also influenced by seasonal considerations. Medieval people observed that certain times of the year seemed more conducive to conception, and they adjusted their sexual practices accordingly. Spring was often considered the optimal time for conception, as it aligned with natural cycles of renewal and abundance. This seasonal approach to reproduction was influenced by both practical considerations, such as food availability and agricultural cycles, and by medical theories about the body's changing needs throughout the year. Medieval abortion practices were complex and varied, encompassing both surgical procedures and pharmaceutical interventions. Medical texts from the period describe various methods for ending unwanted pregnancies, ranging from herbal preparations to more invasive surgical techniques. These practices were not relegated to back-alley procedures performed by unqualified practitioners, but were often carried out by trained physicians and experienced midwives who understood both the medical and legal implications of their actions. The surgical techniques described in medieval medical texts are surprisingly sophisticated. Some sources describe procedures for dealing with difficult births, including what we would today call late-term abortions, performed to save the mother's life. These procedures required considerable skill and anatomical knowledge, suggesting that medieval medical practitioners had a much more advanced understanding of reproductive anatomy than is commonly assumed. The fact that such procedures are documented in medical texts indicates that they were considered legitimate medical interventions rather than criminal acts. Herbal abortifacients were widely known and used throughout the medieval period. Medical texts often included detailed recipes for preparations designed to induce menstruation or cause miscarriage, using combinations of plants with known abortive properties. These recipes were often disguised with euphemistic language, referring to remedies that would restore regular menstruation or cleanse the womb. But their true purpose was understood by both practitioners and patients. The legal status of abortion in medieval society was complicated and varied considerably across different regions and time periods. Early medieval law codes often treated abortion as a property crime against the father or husband, rather than as murder, suggesting that the fetus was not considered to have full legal personhood. The penalties for abortion were typically financial rather than capital, and they were often less severe than penalties for other forms of assault or property damage. Church doctrine on abortion was more complex than modern debates might suggest. While the Church opposed the intentional termination of pregnancy, there was considerable debate about when the soul entered the body and when terminating a pregnancy became equivalent to murder. Many medieval theologians followed Aristotelian theories that suggested the soul didn't enter the body until several weeks after conception, creating a period during which early abortion might be considered less serious than later termination. This doctrinal complexity created practical ambiguities that medieval women and their caregivers could exploit when necessary. A woman experiencing what might be called a delayed menstrual period could seek treatment to restore her normal cycle without necessarily acknowledging that she might be pregnant. This linguistic and conceptual flexibility allowed for pregnancy termination within a framework that didn't directly challenge religious authority while still providing women with reproductive choices. The role of midwives in medieval society extended far beyond assisting with childbirth. These women served as repositories of knowledge about all aspects of female reproductive health, from contraception to abortion to fertility treatments. Midwives were often the most medically knowledgeable people in their communities when it came to women's health issues, and they maintained networks of information sharing that allowed them to stay current with new treatments and techniques. Midwives occupied a unique social position that gave them considerable authority and respect within their communities. They were often called upon to provide expert testimony in legal cases involving questions of pregnancy, virginity, or paternity. Their knowledge was considered reliable enough that courts would accept their opinions on matters that could determine the outcome of inheritance disputes or accusations of adultery. This legal recognition of their expertise demonstrates the high level of respect accorded to their professional knowledge. The training informal of midwives was typically but thorough, involving years of apprenticeship with experienced practitioners. Young women who showed aptitude and interest would be taken on as assistants and gradually taught the complex skills required for the profession. This training with births, but also extensive knowledge of her stereotypical image, included not only practical techniques for aspal medicine, reproductive rest and of rep anatomy, and the social and legal aspects of their work. Medieval attitudes toward female sexuality were far more complex than ignorant women suggests. Medical texts from the period acknowledge that women experienced sexual desire and pleasure, and they often discuss the importance of mutual satisfaction in sexual relationships. Some physicians argued that female orgasm was necessary for conception, which meant that women's sexual pleasure was considered medically important rather than merely indulgent. This understanding of female sexuality influenced medical advice about sexual technique and frequency. Physicians sometimes recommended specific approaches to lovemaking that would ensure female satisfaction, not just for the woman's enjoyment, but because they believed it would improve the chances of successful conception. This medical emphasis on female sexual pleasure created a framework within which women's desires could be acknowledged and addressed, even within the constraints of religious doctrine. Medieval women were also recognized as having agency in sexual relationships, at least within certain bounds. Medical texts often discuss the importance of consent and mutual desire in sexual relationships, and they acknowledge that forced or unwanted sexual activity could have negative effects on both physical and mental health. While these discussions occurred within a framework that ultimately privileged male authority, they nevertheless represented a recognition of women's sexual autonomy that might seem surprising, given common assumptions about medieval gender roles. The intersection of medical knowledge and religious doctrine created interesting opportunities for medieval women to exercise control over their reproductive lives. When physicians recommended sexual activity or specific sexual practices for medical reasons, women could pursue their desires while maintaining the appearance of following medical advice, rather than simply indulging in pleasure. This medical justification provided a socially acceptable way for women to advocate for their sexual needs within relationships. Medieval prostitution was a complex institution that served multiple social and economic functions beyond simple sexual commerce. A unique position in medieval society. Existing prostitutes occupy outside normal social hierarchies, while still being integrated into urban economic systems. They were often subject to specific regulations and restrictions, but they were also recognized as providing a necessary service that helped maintain social order by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise disrupt marriages and families. The regulation of prostitution varied considerably across different medieval societies, but it was rarely completely prohibited. Instead, authorities typically sought to control and manage the trade through licensing systems, designated districts, and specific rules about conduct and appearance. These regulations were designed to contain the potential by prostitution, while still social disruption cause allowing it to function as an economic activity and social safety valve. Prostitutes, the trade for different themselves, came from various social backgrounds and enter reasons. Some were women who had been abandoned or widowed and had few other economic options. Others chose prostitution as a way to achieve economic independence that wouldn't have been available through other means. Still others may have been forced into the trade through various forms of coercion, though the extent of forced prostitution in medieval society is difficult to determine from surviving sources. The relationship between prostitution and marriage in medieval society reveals interesting aspects of how sexual relationships were understood and categorized. Prostitution was often seen as a necessary evil that protected the institution of marriage by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that wives couldn't or wouldn't satisfy. This understanding suggests a complex view of sexuality that recognized the existence of desires that couldn't always be contained equitable marriage relationships. Medieval urban within the bounds of RSP centers developed sophisticated systems for managing prostitution that balanced moral concerns with practical necessities. Cities often designated specific districts or streets where prostitution was permitted while prohibiting it elsewhere. These red light districts were typically located near city walls or in other marginal areas, symbolically placing sexual commerce on the boundaries of respectable society while still keeping it within the urban economic system. The economic aspects of medieval prostitution were considerable, involving not just the women who provided sexual services, but also landlords who rented properties, city officials who collected taxes and fees, and various other participants in the urban economy. Some cities derived significant revenue from the regulation and taxation of prostitution, creating a financial incentive to maintain the trade, even when moral authorities argued for its suppression. Medieval attitudes toward homosexuality were similarly complex and varied considerably across different regions and time periods. While Christian doctrine officially condemned homosexual activity, the enforcement of these prohibitions was inconsistent, and there's evidence that same-sex relationships existed at all levels of society. The legal penalties for homosexual activity ranged from mild penances to severe punishments. but actual prosecutions seem to have been relatively rare, suggesting that such relationships were often tolerated as long as they remained discreet. The medieval understanding of sexuality wasn't based on modern concepts of sexual orientation or identity. Instead, sexual behavior was typically categorized in terms of specific acts, rather than inherent characteristics or preferences. This meant that a man who occasionally engaged in homosexual activity wouldn't necessarily be labeled or treated differently from other men, as long as he also fulfilled his expected social roles regarding marriage and family. Religious institutions, particularly monasteries and convents, created environments where same-sex relationships could develop relatively freely, though they were officially discouraged or forbidden. The intense emotional bonds that developed in these communities sometimes crossed the line into physical relationships, creating situations that religious authorities had to address carefully to avoid scandal while maintaining institutional stability. The literature and poetry of the medieval period sometimes celebrated intense same-sex friendships and emotional bonds that modern readers might interpret as romantic or erotic relationships. These works suggest that passionate same-sex relationships were not only acknowledged, but could be celebrated and idealized, at least within certain literary and cultural contexts. The boundaries between friendship, romantic love, and sexual desire were often blurred in ways that allowed for considerable flexibility in how relationships were understood and expressed. Medieval society's approach to sexuality ultimately reveals a world far more complex and sophisticated than common stereotypes suggest. People in the Middle Ages weren't sexually ignorant or uniformly repressed, but were instead navigating intricate systems of religious doctrine, medical understanding, legal regulation, and social expectation that created both constraints and opportunities for sexual expression. Their solutions to the challenges of human sexuality were often creative, pragmatic, and surprisingly modern in their recognition of the complexity of human desires and relationships. The sophistication of medieval sexual culture becomes even more apparent when we examine the role of courtly love, a literary and cultural movement that revolutionized how people thought about romantic relationships. Courtly love emerged in the 12th century, primarily in the courts of southern France, and it introduced ideas about romantic passion that were both revolutionary and deeply influential. Unlike the practical marriage arrangements that dominated medieval society, courtly love celebrated intense, often impossible romantic relationships that existed outside the bounds of marriage. The concept of courtly love typically involved a knight or nobleman who became devoted to a lady of hire another man. The social status, often someone who was already married to a relationship, was characterized by elaborate rituals of devotion, the exchange of poetry and gifts, and a kind of spiritual transformation that the lover underwent through his dedication to his beloved. The physical consummation of these relationships was often delayed indefinitely or avoided entirely, creating a tension between desire and fulfillment that was seen as ennobling and spiritually elevating. This literary tradition had profound effects on how medieval people understood the relationship between love, sex, and marriage. Courtly love suggested that the most intense and meaningful romantic relationships might exist outside marriage, and it celebrated emotional and spiritual connections that transcended physical desire. At the same time, it acknowledged the power of sexual attraction and the transformative effects of romantic passion. The literature of courtly love was filled with elaborate descriptions of physical beauty, passionate longing, and the physical effects of desire, even when it advocated for sexual restraint. The influence of courtly love extended far beyond literature and began to shape actual social relationships. Young nobles began to adopt the language and behaviors associated with courtly love in their real relationships, creating a culture of romantic courtship that was previously unknown in medieval society. This didn't immediately change marriage practices, which remained largely practical arrangements, but it did create new expectations about how lovers should behave and what romantic relationships could offer. The emergence of courtly love also created new opportunities for women to exercise social power and influence. In the traditional framework of medieval society, women's value was primarily determined by their role as wives and mothers, but courtly love celebrated women as objects of devotion and inspiration. Ladies became patrons of poets and musicians, arbiters of romantic disputes, and cultural authorities on matters of love and relationships. This gave some women, particularly those of high social status, a form of cultural influence that complemented but was distinct from their traditional roles. The tension between courtly love ideals and Christian doctrine created fascinating contradictions in medieval culture. While the Church preached that the highest form of love was spiritual love directed toward God, courtly love suggested that romantic passion for another human being could be equally transformative and spiritually significant. Some writers attempted to reconcile these ideas by arguing that earthly love could serve as a stepping stone toward divine love. But the fundamental tension remained unresolved throughout the medieval period. Medieval festivals and celebrations reveal another dimension of medieval sexuality that challenges assumptions about prudishness and restraint. Many traditional festivals included elements that were openly sexual or that temporarily suspended normal social rules about sexual behavior. These celebrations served as safety valves that allowed communities to express desires and behaviors that were normally restricted or forbidden. The most famous of these celebrations was Carnival, the period of feasting and celebration that preceded Lent. During Carnival, normal social hierarchies were often temporarily inverted. Sexual behavior that would normally be condemned was tolerated or even encouraged, and communities engaged in ritualistic celebrations of fertility and abundance. These festivals weren't simply pagan holdovers that survived despite Christian influence, but were often integrated into Christian calendar and understood as legitimate parts of the religious year. Carnival celebrations typically included elaborate processions featuring sexual imagery, theatrical performances with sexual themes, and various forms of ritualized sexual behavior. Young people used these occasions to engage in courtship activities that would be inappropriate at other times of the year, and married couples often used the festival atmosphere as an opportunity to celebrate their own sexuality more openly. The temporary suspension of normal rules created space for sexual expression that was both sanctioned by community tradition and contained within acceptable boundaries. Other festivals throughout the medieval year included similar elements of sexual celebration and temporary rule suspension. May Day celebrations often involved young people spending the night in the woods together, ostensibly to gather flowers and celebrate the arrival of spring, but with the clear understanding that sexual activity was likely to occur. Harvest festivals celebrated fertility and abundance in ways that often included sexual symbolism and opportunities for romantic encounters. Even some religious festivals included elements that modern observers might find surprisingly sexual or irreverent. These festivals served important social functions beyond simply providing entertainment. They created opportunities for young people to meet potential marriage partners in contexts that allowed for more freedom than normal social interactions. They provided married couples with socially sanctioned opportunities to celebrate their sexuality and fertility, and they allowed communities to collectively acknowledge and celebrate human sexuality as a positive force, rather than something that needed to be constantly controlled or suppressed. The integration of these celebrations into the Christian calendar reveals the Church's pragmatic approach to managing human sexuality. Rather than attempting to completely suppress sexual expression, Church authorities often found ways to channel it into acceptable forms and contexts. This allowed people to express their sexuality while maintaining the overall framework of Christian moral teaching, creating a complex system that acknowledged human desires while still maintaining social order. Medieval medical understanding of sexual anatomy and physiology was far more detailed and accurate than many people realize. Physicians of the period had access to classical texts by authors like Galen and Avicenna, and they built upon this foundation with their own observations and theories. While some of their ideas were incorrect by modern standards, others showed remarkable insight into the functioning of the human reproductive system. Medieval physicians understood that both men and women contributed to conception, contrary to some modern assumptions about medieval ignorance. They recognized that women produced their own form of seed that combined with male seed to create new life. And they understood that sexual pleasure was important for both partners in the conception process. Some into considerable detail about sexual anatomy, describing the structure and medical texts went function of sexual organs in ways that were surprisingly accurate. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was particularly sophisticated in some areas. Physicians recognized the existence and function of the clitoris, which they often referred to as the neck of the womb or similar terms. They understood its role in sexual pleasure and its importance for women's sexual health. Medical texts often discussed techniques for stimulating this organ, both for therapeutic purposes and for enhancing sexual pleasure within marriage. Medieval physicians also understood the cyclical nature of female fertility, though their explanations for these cycles were sometimes based on incorrect theories. They recognized that women's sexual desire and fertility varied throughout the month, and they attempted to create calendars that would help couples time their sexual activity to either encourage or discourage conception. While their understanding of ovulation was imperfect, their recognition that fertility was cyclical was essentially correct. The medical literature of the period also included detailed discussions of sexual dysfunction and its treatment. Physicians recognized that both men and women could experience problems with sexual desire or performance, and they developed various treatments for these conditions. These treatments ranged from dietary recommendations and herbal preparations to more complex therapeutic interventions. The fact that these issues were discussed openly in medical texts suggests that sexual problems were recognized as legitimate medical concerns rather than moral failings. Medieval physicians also understood the connection between physical health and sexual function. They recognized that illness, poor nutrition, stress, and other factors could affect sexual desire and performance, and they developed holistic approaches to treatment that addressed these underlying causes. This understanding led to comprehensive treatment plans that might include dietary changes, exercise recommendations, herbal medicines, and lifestyle modifications designed to improve overall health and sexual function. The role of astrology in medieval medicine created another layer of complexity in sexual healthcare. Physicians believed that the positions of the planets and stars influenced human health and behavior, including sexual desire and fertility. They created elaborate systems for timing sexual activity according to astrological calculations, believing that couples who followed these guidelines would be more likely to conceive healthy children and maintain good sexual health. These astrological considerations influenced everything from the timing of weddings to the scheduling of sexual activity within marriage. Some medical texts provided detailed charts showing the most favorable times for conception based on astrological calculations, while others warned against sexual activity during certain planetary alignments that were believed to be harmful. While modern medicine rejects astrological influences on health, the medieval integration of astronomy and medicine demonstrates the sophisticated theoretical frameworks that physicians use to understand human sexuality. Medieval understanding of sexual health also included recognition of the psychological and emotional aspects of sexuality. Physicians understood that mental state could affect sexual function, and they developed treatments that addressed both physical and psychological factors. They recognized that stress, depression, anger, and other emotional states could interfere with sexual desire and performance, and they prescribed treatments that were designed to address these underlying psychological issues. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated approaches to sexual education. While formal sex education as we understand it didn't exist, young people learned about sexuality through a variety of informal channels. Medical texts were sometimes used to educate young married couples about sexual technique and reproductive health. Religious authorities provided guidance about sexual behavior within marriage, though this education was often focused more on what was prohibited than on positive instruction about sexual pleasure and technique. Mothers and other experienced women played crucial roles in educating young women about sexuality, marriage, and childbirth. This education often took place in the context of preparing for marriage, when older women would share practical advice about managing sexual relationships, avoiding unwanted pregnancy, and maintaining sexual health. The informal networks of women that provided this education were crucial for transmitting sexual knowledge from one generation to the next. Similarly, young men learned about sexuality through informal networks of older men, though the content and quality of this education varied considerably. Military settings, apprenticeship arrangements, and other male-dominated environments provided opportunities for sexual education. Though this education was often focused more on conquest and performance than on mutual pleasure and emotional connection. The different approaches to sexual education for men and women reflect the broader gender dynamics of medieval society, but also show that both sexes were expected to have some knowledge about sexuality before marriage. The medieval period also saw the emergence of increasingly sophisticated approaches to sexual technique and pleasure. While religious authorities emphasized the procreative purposes of sex, medical texts and secular literature often provided detailed advice about sexual technique designed to enhance pleasure for both partners. These sources recognized that sexual satisfaction was important for maintaining healthy relationships, and that couples who were sexually compatible were more likely to have successful marriages. Some medieval texts provided remarkably detailed advice about sexual positions, timing, and technique that was designed to maximize pleasure while still remaining within acceptable moral boundaries. These sources often emphasized the importance of mutual consideration and communication between sexual partners, suggesting that medieval people understood sexuality as a collaborative activity that required attention to both partners' needs and desires. The emergence of vernacular literature in the later medieval period created new opportunities for the dissemination of sexual knowledge. Works written in local languages rather than Latin could reach broader audiences, including people who weren't educated in classical languages. These vernacular texts often included more practical and accessible advice about sexuality than the scholarly medical texts that were written in Latin for educated elites. Medieval attitudes toward aging and sexuality reveal another dimension of the period's complex understanding of human sexuality. Unlike some later periods that viewed sexuality as primarily the province of the young, medieval culture recognized that sexual desire and activity could continue throughout life. Medical texts discussed the sexual health needs of older adults, and they provided advice about maintaining sexual function and pleasure into old age. The medieval understanding of aging and sexuality was influenced by medical theories about the body's changing needs throughout life. Physicians believed that older adults might require different approaches to sexual health than younger people, and they developed specific recommendations for maintaining sexual function as people aged. These recommendations often included dietary advice, exercise suggestions, and herbal preparations that were designed to support sexual health in later life. Medieval culture also recognized that older adults could serve as sources of sexual wisdom and guidance for younger people. Experienced older women often served as matchmakers, marriage counselors, and sources of practical advice about sexual relationships. Their knowledge was valued precisely because it was based on years of experience with the realities of sexual relationships, rather than theoretical understanding alone. The integration of sexuality into medieval understanding of the complete human experience meant that sexual relationships were seen as important components of overall well-being throughout life. This holistic approach to sexuality created a framework within which people could continue to pursue sexual satisfaction and intimacy, even as they aged, challenging modern assumptions about medieval attitudes toward older adults and sexuality. As we've seen throughout this exploration, medieval sexuality was characterized by complexity, sophistication, and pragmatic adaptation to human needs and desires. Far from the repressed and ignorant society that stereotypes suggest, Medieval people developed nuanced approaches to sexuality that balanced religious doctrine, medical understanding, social needs, and individual desires in ways that created space for sexual expression while maintaining social stability. Their solutions to the challenges of human sexuality were often creative, practical, and surprisingly modern in their recognition of the importance of sexual health and satisfaction for overall human well-being. The medieval period's approach to sexuality offers valuable insights into how societies can navigate the tension between moral ideals and human realities. Rather than attempting to completely suppress sexual desire, medieval culture found ways to channel and accommodate sexuality within acceptable social frameworks. This approach required constant negotiation and adaptation, but it ultimately created a sexual culture that was both more complex and more permissive than common stereotypes suggest. Understanding medieval sexuality also challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about historical progress and social evolution. The medieval period's sophisticated approaches to contraception, sexual health, and relationship dynamics demonstrate that sexual knowledge and practices don't always follow a simple, linear progression from ignorance to enlightenment. Instead, different societies develop different solutions to universal human challenges, and some medieval approaches to sexuality were arguably more sophisticated and humane than practices that developed in later periods. The legacy of medieval sexuality can be seen in many aspects of modern sexual culture, from our understanding of the relationship between love and sex to our approaches to sexual health and education. While we've certainly developed new knowledge and techniques, many of the fundamental challenges that medieval people faced in navigating human sexuality remain relevant today. Their creative solutions to these challenges offer valuable perspectives on the ongoing human project of understanding and expressing sexuality in ways that honor both individual desires and social needs. The medical profession in medieval times also understood something that might shock modern audiences. They recognized that sexual dysfunction could be treated medically. Medieval physicians didn't view impotence or lack of sexual desire as moral failings or divine punishments, but as legitimate health problems that required intervention. They developed comprehensive treatment protocols that addressed both physical and psychological factors affecting sexual performance and satisfaction. These treatments were remarkably holistic, incorporating dietary modifications, herbal preparations, lifestyle changes, and even what we might today recognize as early forms of sex therapy. Physicians recommended specific foods believed to enhance sexual vigor, including eggs, nuts, certain spices, and various meats. They prescribed herbal concoctions containing ingredients like ginseng, saffron, and other plants with documented effects on circulation and arousal. Some treatments involved elaborate rituals combining medical intervention with psychological suggestion, recognizing that sexual function involved both body and mind. The medieval understanding of sexual health extended to recognition of what we would now call sexual compatibility within marriage. Medical texts acknowledged that couples might experience difficulties in their sexual relationships and provided advice for addressing these problems. Physicians understood that sexual dissatisfaction could lead to broader marital problems and even health issues, so they took these concerns seriously and developed interventions designed to help couples achieve sexual harmony. Medieval physicians could have multiple causes, also recognized that sexual problems, including physical illness, emotional distress, relationship conflicts, and even supernatural influences. This comprehensive approach led to treatment plans that might address everything from underlying medical conditions to relationship counseling to spiritual interventions. The integration of multiple therapeutic approaches reflects a sophisticated understanding of sexuality as a complex phenomenon influenced by numerous factors. The role of diet in sexual health was particularly emphasized in medieval medical practice. Physicians believed that certain foods could enhance or diminish sexual desire and performance, and they developed elaborate dietary prescriptions for people experiencing sexual difficulties. Hot foods were generally believed to increase sexual desire, while cold foods were thought to diminish it. Physicians would carefully balance patients' diets to achieve the desired effects on sexual function while maintaining overall health. Medieval medical texts also discuss the importance of timing in sexual relationships, both in terms of optimal times for sexual activity and the pacing of sexual encounters. Physicians believed that rushing sexual activity could be harmful to both partners and that proper timing was essential for both pleasure and conception. They provided detailed advice about foreplay, the importance of mutual arousal, and techniques for ensuring that both partners achieve satisfaction. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated understanding of the relationship between exercise and sexual health. Physicians recognized that physical fitness affected sexual function and recommended specific exercises designed to enhance sexual performance. These recommendations were based on observations about blood flow, muscle tone, and overall vitality, showing a practical understanding of the physical aspects of sexuality that was quite advanced for its time. Medieval culture also developed complex social rituals around sexuality that served to educate young people and reinforce social norms while still acknowledging human desires. Wedding ceremonies themselves often included elements that celebrated sexuality and fertility, with traditions that openly acknowledged the sexual aspects of marriage. These rituals served both to sanctify sexual relationships within marriage and to provide community support for new couples as they navigated their sexual relationships. The period also saw the emergence of marriage manuals and guides that provided practical advice for newly married couples. These texts combined religious instruction with practical guidance about sexual technique, relationship management, and household organization. While they emphasized the religious and social purposes of marriage, they also acknowledged the importance of sexual satisfaction for marital happiness and provided detailed advice about achieving this satisfaction within acceptable moral boundaries. Medieval understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was also more sophisticated than commonly assumed, with detailed knowledge about fetal development, optimal conditions for conception, and the management of pregnancy and childbirth. This knowledge influenced sexual practices within marriage, as couples learned to time their sexual activity according to their desires for children and their understanding of optimal conditions for conception and maternal health. The medieval period's approach to sexual education within marriage often involved elaborate systems of mentorship and guidance. Newly married couples were often supported by experienced married couples who provided advice and guidance about sexual relationships, household management, and the challenges of married life. This system created networks of support that helped young couples navigate the transition to married life and develop successful sexual relationships. Medieval culture also developed sophisticated approaches to managing sexual desire outside of marriage. While the Church officially condemned all non-marital sexual activity, practical approaches to managing these desires were more nuanced. Religious authorities often provided guidance that acknowledged the reality of sexual temptation, while offering practical strategies for managing these desires in socially acceptable ways. The concept of sublimation, redirecting sexual energy toward other activities, was well understood in medieval culture. Religious communities developed elaborate systems of physical labor, intellectual activity, artistic creation, and spiritual practice that were designed to provide outlets for sexual energy while maintaining celibacy. These approaches recognized that sexual desire was a powerful force that needed to be channeled rather than simply suppressed. Medieval monasteries and convents developed particularly sophisticated approaches to managing sexuality within celibate communities. These institutions created structured environments that minimized sexual temptation while providing meaningful alternatives to sexual relationships. The success of these communities in maintaining celibate lifestyles over centuries demonstrates the effectiveness of their approaches to sexual management. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly complex legal frameworks around sexuality and sexual behavior. These laws went far beyond simple prohibitions to create detailed systems for managing sexual relationships, protecting sexual rights, and resolving sexual disputes. Medieval legal codes addressed issues like rape, adultery, prostitution, and sexual violence with sophisticated approaches that often provided more protection for victims than later legal systems. Medieval law recognized different categories of sexual violence and prescribed different punishments based on the circumstances of the crime and the social status of the people involved. While these laws often reflected the gender and class inequalities of medieval society, they also provided legal recourse for victims of sexual violence and established important precedents for protecting sexual rights. The legal treatment of rape in medieval society was more complex than modern stereotypes suggest. While women's testimony about sexual violence was often given less weight than men's testimony, medieval law did recognize rape as a serious crime and provided legal remedies for victims. Some medieval legal codes included provisions for compensating rape victims and punishing perpetrators. Though the effectiveness of these laws varied considerably across different regions and time periods, medieval legal systems also developed sophisticated approaches to managing prostitution that balanced moral concerns with practical necessities. Rather than simply prohibiting prostitution, many medieval legal codes created regulatory frameworks that controlled the trade while recognizing its social and economic functions. These laws often included provisions for protecting sex workers from violence and exploitation, while also maintaining public order. The regulation of marriage and divorce in medieval law created complex systems for managing sexual relationships within legal frameworks. While divorce was generally difficult to obtain, medieval law did provide mechanisms for ending marriages in cases of sexual incompatibility, impotence, or other sexual problems. These legal provisions recognized that sexual satisfaction was important for marital success and provided remedies when sexual relationships failed. Medieval inheritance law also reflected sophisticated understanding of sexuality and reproduction. Legal codes included detailed provisions for determining paternity, managing the inheritance rights of illegitimate children, and protecting the interests of widows and orphans. These laws recognized the complex relationships between sexuality, reproduction, and property rights that characterized medieval society. The development of canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, created additional layers of regulation around sexuality that often conflicted with secular legal systems. The tension between religious and secular approaches to sexual regulation created complex legal environments where individuals had to navigate multiple, sometimes contradictory, legal frameworks. This complexity required sophisticated legal knowledge and often led to creative interpretations of law that accommodated human needs while maintaining legal compliance. Medieval courts developed specialized procedures for handling sexual crimes and disputes that reflected the sensitive nature of these issues. These procedures often included provisions for protecting the privacy of victims, ensuring fair hearings, and providing appropriate remedies. While medieval legal systems certainly had significant flaws, they also developed innovative approaches to managing sexual disputes that influenced later legal development. The emergence of universities in the later medieval period created new opportunities for the systematic study of sexuality and sexual behavior. University-trained physicians, theologians, and lawyers developed increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding sexuality that combined classical learning with contemporary observation and experience. These academic developments influenced both medical practice and legal regulation of sexuality. Medieval universities also created environments where intellectual discussions about sexuality could take place in relatively open forums. Scholarly debates about sexual ethics, medical theories of sexuality, and legal approaches to sexual regulation created bodies of knowledge that influenced both academic understanding and practical approaches to sexual issues. These discussions often pushed the boundaries of acceptable discourse about sexuality while remaining within acceptable academic frameworks. The translation movement of the medieval period, which brought classical texts about sexuality and medicine into Latin and vernacular languages, created new opportunities for the dissemination of sexual knowledge. Works by ancient authors like Galen, Avicenna, and others became available to medieval readers, providing access to sophisticated theories about sexuality that had been developed in earlier periods. These translations often included commentary and additions by medieval scholars who updated ancient knowledge with contemporary observations and theories. The combination of classical learning with medieval innovation created synthetic approaches to sexuality that were more sophisticated than either tradition alone. This scholarly synthesis influenced both medical practice and popular understanding of sexuality throughout the medieval period. Medieval artistic representations of sexuality reveal another dimension of the period's complex attitudes towards sexual behavior. While religious art often emphasized spiritual themes, secular art frequently included sexual imagery and themes that celebrated human sexuality within appropriate social contexts. These artistic works provide valuable insights into how medieval people understood and expressed sexuality in their daily lives. The emergence of vernacular literature in the later medieval period created new opportunities for the artistic exploration of sexual themes. Works like the Fableaux of medieval France, the Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer, and other literary productions often included frank discussions of sexuality that would have been inappropriate in religious contexts. These literary works provide evidence of popular attitudes towards sexuality that complement the official doctrines found in religious and medical texts. Medieval music also included sexual themes and imagery, particularly in secular songs and popular ballads. These musical works often celebrated romantic love and sexual desire in ways that reflected popular attitudes towards sexuality. The integration of sexual themes into musical culture demonstrates that sexuality was an accepted part of artistic expression, even within the constraints of medieval moral frameworks. The decorative arts of the medieval period also included sexual imagery and symbolism, from manuscript illuminations to architectural sculpture to household objects. These artistic representations often use sexual symbolism to convey broader themes about fertility, prosperity, and human flourishing. The prevalence of sexual imagery in medieval art suggests that sexuality was viewed as a positive force that could be celebrated within appropriate contexts. Medieval festivals and celebrations often included artistic performances that incorporated sexual themes and imagery. These performances served both entertainment and educational functions, providing communities with opportunities to explore sexual themes in controlled, socially sanctioned environments. The integration of sexual themes into community celebrations demonstrates the role that sexuality played in medieval social life. The medieval period's approach to sexuality ultimately reveals a culture that was far more sophisticated, nuanced, and permissive than common stereotypes suggest. Rather than being uniformly repressive or ignorant about sexual matters, medieval society developed complex systems for managing sexuality that balanced religious ideals with human realities. These systems created space for sexual expression while maintaining social order, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to human sexuality that acknowledged both its power and its importance. Medieval people understood sexuality as a fundamental aspect of human experience that required careful management rather than simple suppression. Their approaches to sexual regulation, education, and healthcare reflect sophisticated understanding of the complex relationships between sexuality, health, social order, and individual fulfillment. While medieval sexual culture certainly had its limitations and inequalities, it also demonstrated remarkable creativity and adaptability in addressing the universal human challenges of sexual expression and regulation. The legacy of medieval sexuality can be seen in many aspects of modern sexual culture, from our understanding of sexual health, to our approaches to sexual education, to our legal frameworks for managing sexual behavior. While we have certainly developed new knowledge and techniques, many of the fundamental insights about human sexuality that were developed during the medieval period remain relevant today. Understanding medieval sexuality also provides valuable perspective on contemporary debates about sexual morality, regulation, and education. The medieval period's pragmatic approaches to balancing moral ideals with human realities offer insights that remain relevant as modern societies continue to grapple with questions about how to manage sexuality in ways that honor both individual desires and social needs. The medieval period's recognition of sexuality as a complex phenomenon requiring multiple approaches and perspectives also provides valuable lessons for contemporary sexual culture. Rather than seeking simple solutions to complex problems, medieval approaches to sexuality often involved careful balance between competing interests and needs. This approach to sexual regulation and management offers insights that remain relevant for contemporary societies facing similar challenges. As we continue to develop our understanding of human sexuality, the medieval period's contributions to sexual knowledge and practice provide important historical perspective on the ongoing human project of understanding and expressing sexuality in socially constructive ways. Their creative solutions to the challenges of human sexuality demonstrate the importance of pragmatic, nuanced approaches that acknowledge both the power and the complexity of sexual desire and behavior. Medieval society also developed surprisingly progressive approaches to what we would now call marital counseling and relationship guidance. When couples experienced sexual or emotional difficulties in their marriages, they didn't just suffer in silence or resign themselves to unhappy unions. Instead, medieval communities had established systems for addressing marital problems that involved both religious and secular authorities. Parish priests often served as marriage counselors, providing guidance to couples experiencing difficulties in their relationships. These clerical counselors were trained to address both the spiritual and practical aspects of marital problems, including sexual incompatibility, communication issues, and conflicts over household management. The Church developed detailed protocols for addressing different types of marital problems, with specific approaches for sexual difficulties versus other relationship issues. Priests were trained to ask sensitive questions about intimate relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries and confidentiality. They understood that sexual problems could stem from physical, emotional, or spiritual causes, and they developed comprehensive approaches that addressed all these potential factors. Some priests maintained networks of married couples who could serve as mentors and advisors for younger couples experiencing difficulties, creating community-based support systems that provided practical guidance alongside spiritual counsel. Secular authorities also played roles in resolving marital disputes, particularly when those disputes involved property, inheritance, or other legal issues. Medieval courts developed specialized procedures for handling marital conflicts that recognize the sensitive nature of intimate relationships while still providing legal remedies for serious problems. These legal frameworks often included provisions for mediation and reconciliation before resorting to more drastic measures like separation or annulment. The goal was usually to preserve marriages whenever possible, while still protecting individuals from abuse or exploitation. Medieval communities also developed informal networks of relationship guidance that operated alongside official religious and legal systems. Experienced married women often served as advisors and confidants for younger women navigating marital difficulties, providing practical advice about managing relationships, dealing with difficult husbands, and maintaining household harmony. These informal support networks were particularly important for addressing issues that women might be reluctant to discuss with male religious authorities, creating safe spaces for honest conversations about intimate concerns. The medieval understanding of what constituted a successful marriage was more complex than simple economic or political alliance. While practical considerations certainly mattered, medieval people also recognized that emotional compatibility, sexual satisfaction, and mutual respect were important components of marital success. Marriage manuals from the period often emphasized the importance of kindness, patience, and consideration between spouses, suggesting that medieval people understood marriage as requiring ongoing effort and attention from both partners. Medieval approaches to resolving sexual problems within marriage were remarkably sophisticated and practical. When couples experienced difficulties with sexual compatibility, they were often provided with detailed guidance about technique, timing, and communication that was designed to improve their intimate relationships. This guidance was based on medical understanding of sexual physiology combined with practical experience from successful marriages, creating comprehensive approaches that addressed both physical and emotional aspects of sexual relationships. The period also saw the development of increasingly nuanced understanding of the relationship between emotional intimacy and sexual satisfaction. Medieval writers recognized that couples who communicated well and maintained emotional closeness were more likely to have satisfying sexual relationships, while those who experienced emotional distance or conflict often struggled with sexual problems as well. This understanding led to counseling approaches that addressed both emotional and sexual aspects of marital relationships, recognizing that these elements were interconnected and needed to be addressed together. Medieval society's approach to managing extramarital relationships reveals another layer of complexity in their understanding of human sexuality. While adultery was officially condemned and legally punishable, the actual enforcement of these prohibitions was often inconsistent and pragmatic. Communities generally tolerated discrete extramarital relationships that didn't disrupt social order or challenge existing power structures, while coming down harshly on relationships that created public scandal or threatened important alliances. The double standards that applied to male and female adultery reflected broader gender inequalities in medieval society, but they also revealed sophisticated understanding of the different social consequences that extramarital relationships could have. Male infidelity was often overlooked as long as it didn't involve the wives of social superiors or create financial obligations that threatened the family's economic stability. Female adultery was viewed more seriously because it potentially threatened inheritance lines and family honor. But even here there were gradations of response depending on the circumstances and social status of the people involved. Medieval legal systems developed complex approaches to managing adultery cases that balanced moral condemnation with practical considerations. Rather than simply punishing all adulterous relationships equally, courts often considered factors like the duration of the relationship, whether children were involved, the social status of the participants, and the degree of public scandal created. These nuanced approaches reflected understanding that human relationships were complex, and that rigid application of moral rules could sometimes create more problems than it solved. Some medieval communities also developed systems for managing what we might now call open marriages, or consensual non-monogamy. These arrangements were usually informal and discreet, but they allowed couples to accommodate different sexual needs and desires while maintaining their primary marital relationships. Such arrangements required considerable trust and communication between spouses, and they were typically only successful when both partners genuinely consented to the arrangement and maintained clear boundaries about what was acceptable. The medieval period also saw the emergence of increasingly sophisticated understanding of sexual identity and individual differences in sexual desire and behavior. While they didn't have modern concepts of sexual orientation or gender identity, medieval people recognized that individuals varied considerably in their sexual interests, appetites, and behaviors. Medical texts acknowledge that some people had stronger or weaker sexual desires than others, and that these differences were largely innate rather than moral choices. This recognition of individual differences led to more personalized approaches to sexual health and relationship guidance. Rather than applying one-size-fits-all solutions to sexual problems, medieval counselors and physicians often tailored their advice to individual circumstances and personalities. They understood that what worked for one couple might not work for another, and they developed flexible approaches that could be adapted to different situations and needs. Medieval understanding of sexual development and life cycle changes was also quite sophisticated. They recognized that sexual desires and capabilities change throughout life, from adolescence through old age, and they developed age-appropriate guidance for managing sexuality at different life stages. Young people received different advice than middle-aged adults, and older adults were provided with guidance that acknowledged their changing physical capabilities while still affirming the importance of intimacy and sexual expression. The transition from adolescence to adulthood was understood as a particularly important period for sexual development, and medieval communities developed elaborate systems for guiding young people through this transition. These systems included both formal religious instruction and informal mentorship relationships that helped young adults understand their sexual desires and learn to manage them appropriately. The goal was not to suppress sexual desire, but to channel it into socially acceptable forms that would contribute to individual fulfillment and social stability. Medieval approaches to managing sexual desire during periods of enforced celibacy, such as during religious fasts or after childbirth, were also sophisticated and practical. Rather than simply demanding that people suppress their desires through willpower alone, medieval guides provided detailed strategies for redirecting sexual energy into other activities. These strategies included physical exercise, intellectual pursuits, artistic creation, and spiritual practices that were designed to provide satisfaction and fulfillment while maintaining the required celibacy. Religious communities developed particularly elaborate systems for managing sexuality within celibate lifestyles. Monasteries and convents created structured environments that minimized sexual temptation while providing meaningful alternatives to sexual relationships. These environments included opportunities for deep friendships, creative expression, intellectual growth, and spiritual development that could provide emotional and psychological satisfaction comparable to what might be found in sexual relationships. The medieval period's understanding of the relationship between spirituality and sexuality was complex and often paradoxical. While official religious doctrine often portrayed sexuality as a potential obstacle to spiritual development, many medieval thinkers also recognized that sexual experience could provide insights into divine love and spiritual union. This understanding led to sophisticated theological discussions about the relationship between earthly and divine love that influenced both religious practice and popular culture. Some medieval mystical traditions explicitly used sexual imagery and metaphors to describe spiritual experiences, suggesting that sexuality and spirituality were understood as related rather than opposed forces in human life. These traditions often emphasized the transformative power of both sexual and spiritual union, and they developed practices that integrated physical, emotional, and spiritual elements in ways that honored all aspects of human experience. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated approaches to sexual ethics that went beyond simple rules and prohibitions to consider the intentions, consequences, and circumstances surrounding sexual behavior. Medieval moral theologians developed detailed frameworks for evaluating sexual behavior that considered not just the acts themselves, but also the motivations behind them, the effects on the people involved, and the broader social consequences. These ethical frameworks often allowed for considerable flexibility in applying moral rules to specific situations, recognizing that human relationships were complex and that rigid moral codes might sometimes produce unjust or harmful results. This approach to sexual ethics emphasized the importance of wisdom, compassion, and prudent judgment in making moral decisions about sexual behavior, rather than simply following predetermined rules without consideration of circumstances. Medieval approaches to sexual education and guidance also recognized the importance of positive role models and examples of healthy sexual relationships solely on what, rather than focusing, was prohibited or problematic. Medieval educators often emphasize positive examples of successful marriages and relationships that demonstrated healthy approaches to sexuality. These positive models provided young people with concrete examples of how to integrate sexuality into fulfilling and socially constructive lives. The period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated understanding of the psychological and emotional dimensions of sexuality. Medieval writers recognized that sexual problems often had psychological roots, and that successful sexual relationships required emotional intelligence, empathy, and communication skills. This understanding led to approaches to sexual education and counseling that addressed both practical techniques and emotional skills necessary for successful intimate relationships. Medieval society's approach to managing sexual health and hygiene was more advanced than commonly assumed, with detailed knowledge about maintaining sexual health and preventing sexually transmitted infections. While their understanding of disease transmission was incomplete by modern standards, medieval people had practical knowledge about sexual hygiene that helped reduce the spread of infections and maintain sexual health. Medical texts from the period included detailed advice about sexual hygiene for both men and women, including recommendations for cleansing before and after sexual activity, recognizing signs of infection, and treating common sexual health problems. These recommendations were based on centuries of practical experience and observation, and while they sometimes included incorrect theories, they also contained valuable practical wisdom about maintaining sexual health. Medieval physicians also understood the connection between overall health and sexual function, recognizing that poor nutrition, lack of exercise, stress, and other health problems could affect sexual desire and performance. This holistic approach to sexual health led to comprehensive treatment plans that addressed all aspects of health rather than focusing narrowly on sexual symptoms alone. The medieval period's recognition of sexuality as an integral part of human health and well-being created frameworks for addressing sexual problems that were both practical and compassionate. Rather than viewing sexual difficulties as moral failings or spiritual punishments, medieval medical approaches treated these problems as legitimate health concerns that deserved professional attention and care. This medical approach to sexuality provided alternatives to purely religious or moral approaches that could be more effective for addressing practical problems. Medieval communities also developed systems for supporting individuals whose sexual desires or behaviors didn't conform to social norms. While these systems were certainly imperfect and often reflected the prejudices of their time, they also demonstrated recognition that human sexuality was diverse and that communities needed to find ways to accommodate this diversity while maintaining social cohesion. These support systems often involved informal networks of understanding individuals who could provide guidance, protection, and community for people whose sexuality didn't fit conventional patterns. While such arrangements were necessary, they demonstrated that discrete and limited medieval communities were capable of compassion and flexibility in addressing the needs of sexual minorities, even within restrictive social frameworks. The medieval period's approach to sexuality ultimately reveals a culture that was far more sophisticated, compassionate, and practical than stereotypes suggest. Rather than being uniformly repressive or ignorant, medieval society developed nuanced approaches to sexuality that acknowledged both its complexity and its importance in human life. These approaches created space for sexual expression and satisfaction while maintaining social order and religious values, demonstrating a pragmatic wisdom about human nature that remains relevant today. Medieval people understood that sexuality was a powerful force that required careful management rather than simple suppression, and they developed creative solutions for channeling sexual energy in socially constructive ways. Their recognition of individual differences in sexual desire and behavior, combined with their practical approaches to sexual health and relationship guidance, created systems for managing sexuality that were both effective and humane within the constraints of their time and place. The legacy of medieval approaches to sexuality can be seen in many aspects of modern sexual culture, from our understanding of the relationship between physical and emotional intimacy to our recognition of the importance of sexual compatibility in successful relationships. While we have certainly developed new knowledge and techniques, the fundamental insights about human sexuality that were developed during the medieval period continue to influence how we understand and manage sexual relationships today. As we continue to grapple with questions about sexual ethics, education, and regulation in contemporary society, the medieval period's pragmatic approaches to balancing competing interests and values offer valuable lessons. Their willingness to acknowledge complexity and nuance in sexual matters, combined with their emphasis on practical wisdom over rigid rules, provides models for addressing sexual issues that honor both individual needs and social responsibilities. The medieval understanding of sexuality as an integral part of human flourishing, rather than simply a biological urge or moral problem, also offers important perspectives for contemporary discussions about sexual health and well-being. Their holistic approaches to sexual health that integrated physical, emotional, spiritual, and social dimensions provide frameworks for understanding sexuality that remain relevant for addressing contemporary sexual issues and challenges. The medieval period's understanding of sexual pleasure itself challenges many modern assumptions about their supposedly prudish attitudes. Medieval medical texts openly discuss the importance of mutual pleasure in sexual relationships, not just as an indulgence, but as a medical necessity. Physicians understood that sexual dissatisfaction could lead to physical and mental health problems for both partners, and they developed detailed guidance for ensuring that both husband and wife achieve satisfaction during intimate encounters. These medical recommendations were remarkably explicit by the standards we might expect from a supposedly repressed era. Physicians provided specific advice about timing, technique, and positioning that was designed to maximize pleasure for both partners. They understood that rushed or selfish sexual encounters were not only spiritually problematic, but also medically harmful, potentially leading to the dreaded condition of seed retention that could cause serious illness. Medieval doctors also recognized what modern sexologists call the importance of foreplay, though they used different terminology. They understood that proper preparation and arousal were essential for both partners' satisfaction and health. Medical texts described in considerable detail the importance of gentle caressing, kissing, and other forms of intimate touching that would prepare both partners for intercourse. This wasn't presented as moral guidance, but as medical necessity, essential for preventing the health problems that could result from unsatisfactory sexual encounters. The medieval understanding of female sexual response was particularly sophisticated. Unlike some later periods that denied or ignored female sexual pleasure, medieval physicians explicitly acknowledged that women experience sexual desire and orgasm, and they considered both to be important for women's health. Some medical theories even suggested that female orgasm was necessary for conception, which meant that a husband who ignored his wife's sexual needs wasn't just being selfish, he was potentially preventing the couple from having children. This medical emphasis on female sexual pleasure created interesting dynamics within medieval marriages. Husbands were essentially given medical justification for paying attention to their wives' sexual needs, and wives could frame their desires for sexual satisfaction in terms of health requirements, rather than mere pleasure-seeking. This medical framework provided a socially acceptable way for couples to discuss and pursue mutual sexual satisfaction within the constraints of religious doctrine. Medieval physicians also understood the cyclical nature of sexual desire, recognizing that both men and women experienced periods of greater and lesser sexual interest. They developed recommendations for couples about how to navigate these natural fluctuations in desire, providing guidance about when to be more or less sexually active, based on various factors including season, health status, and emotional state. This understanding helped couples maintain satisfying sexual relationships over long periods, rather than expecting constant uniform desire. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might recognize as early sex therapy techniques. When couples experienced sexual problems, physicians didn't just prescribe herbal remedies or dietary changes. They also provided counseling about communication, technique, and relationship dynamics that could improve sexual satisfaction. These interventions often involved detailed discussions about timing, positioning, and emotional preparation that were designed to address both physical and psychological barriers to sexual satisfaction. Medieval understanding of sexual compatibility extended beyond physical factors to include emotional and intellectual compatibility. Physicians and relationship counselors recognized that couples who communicated well and shared intellectual interests were more likely to have satisfying sexual relationships. This understanding led to marriage guidance that emphasized the importance of emotional intimacy alongside physical attraction, creating frameworks for understanding marriage that were more sophisticated than simple economic or political arrangements. The period also developed increasingly nuanced approaches to managing sexual desire within different life circumstances. Young, unmarried people received different guidance than married couples, and older adults were provided with advice that acknowledged their changing physical capabilities, while still affirming the importance of sexual expression. This life-stage approach to sexuality recognized that sexual needs and capabilities evolved throughout life, and that sexual guidance needed to be adapted accordingly. Medieval communities also developed systems for addressing sexual problems that went beyond individual counseling to include community support and intervention. When couples experienced serious sexual difficulties that threatened their marriage, extended family members, friends, and even neighbors might become involved in providing guidance and support. These community interventions weren't intrusive meddling, but recognized forms of social support that helped couples work through intimate problems that might otherwise destroy their relationships. The role of godparents and spiritual advisors in medieval society often extended to providing guidance about sexual relationships. These trusted figures served as confidential counselors who could provide advice about intimate matters while maintaining appropriate boundaries and discretion. The involvement of spiritual advisors in sexual counseling reflected the medieval understanding that sexuality had spiritual dimensions that needed to be addressed alongside physical and emotional concerns. Medieval approaches to sexual education were also more comprehensive than commonly assumed. Young people didn't simply learn about sexuality through crude jokes or whispered rumors. Instead, they received formal and informal instruction from parents, religious authorities, and community elders who provided practical guidance about sexual behavior within appropriate moral frameworks. This education often included detailed information about anatomy, technique, and relationship dynamics that prepared young people for successful sexual relationships within marriage. The medieval period's integration of sexuality into broader frameworks of health, morality, and social organization created comprehensive approaches to sexual well-being that addressed multiple dimensions of human experience. Rather than treating sexuality as an isolated biological function, medieval culture understood sexual relationships as complex interactions involving physical, emotional, spiritual, and social elements that all needed to be considered together. Medieval festivals and seasonal celebrations often included elements that explicitly celebrated sexuality and fertility within appropriate social contexts. These celebrations weren't hidden or shameful acknowledgements of human desire, but public affirmations of sexuality as a positive force in human life. Spring festivals celebrated the renewal of fertility and sexual energy after the dormant winter months. Harvest celebrations acknowledged the connection between human sexuality and natural abundance. Wedding celebrations included traditions that explicitly blessed and celebrated the sexual union of the married couple. These public celebrations of sexuality served important social functions beyond entertainment. They created community contexts within which sexuality could be discussed, celebrated, and normalized as a healthy part of human experience. They provided educational opportunities for young people to learn about sexuality within supportive community frameworks. And they reinforced social norms about appropriate sexual behavior, while still acknowledging and celebrating human sexual desire. The medieval period also developed sophisticated approaches to managing the intersection between sexuality and social hierarchy. Different social classes had different sexual privileges and restrictions, but these differences were understood as practical accommodations to social reality, rather than moral judgments about the relative worth of different groups. Nobles might have more sexual freedom in some areas while facing greater restrictions in others, particularly regarding marriage and inheritance. Common people might face fewer restrictions on their choice of sexual partners, while having less access to resources for managing the consequences of sexual activity. These class-based differences in sexual regulation reflected practical considerations about the social consequences of sexual behavior rather than simple prejudice or favoritism. The sexual behavior of nobles could have far-reaching political and economic consequences that affected entire communities, while the sexual choices of common people typically had more limited social impact. This understanding led to differentiated approaches to sexual regulation that attempted to balance individual freedom with social stability. Medieval legal systems also developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to sexual crimes that went beyond simple punishment to include restoration and rehabilitation. Rape cases, for example, were often handled through systems that combined punishment of perpetrators with compensation for victims and community intervention to restore social harmony. These approaches recognized that sexual crimes created complex social problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than simple retribution. The medieval understanding of consent in sexual relationships was more nuanced than often assumed. While medieval law certainly didn't provide the same protections for sexual autonomy that modern legal systems attempt to provide, it did recognize various forms of coercion and exploitation that could invalidate consent to sexual activity. Medieval courts considered factors like age, social status, family pressure, and economic duress when evaluating whether sexual activity was truly consensual. Medieval approaches to sexual violence also included recognition of the long-term psychological and social consequences of such crimes. Legal and social responses to sexual violence often included provisions for ongoing support and protection for victims, recognizing that the immediate legal resolution of cases didn't necessarily address all the harm that had been done. These comprehensive approaches to sexual violence reflected understanding that sexual crimes had complex consequences that required sustained community response. The medieval period's development of increasingly complex institutions for managing sexuality reflected growing recognition of the importance of sexual relationships in human life and social organization. Rather than treating sexuality as a simple biological function that could be easily regulated through moral rules, medieval society developed sophisticated systems that acknowledged the complexity of human sexual behavior and the need for flexible, nuanced approaches to sexual regulation and support. Medieval monasteries and convents developed particularly innovative approaches to managing sexuality within celibate communities that offer insights into alternative ways of organizing intimate relationships. These religious communities created environments where deep emotional bonds could develop between individuals while maintaining celibate lifestyles. The relationships that developed in these settings often included elements of romantic love, intimate friendship, and spiritual partnership that provided many of the emotional benefits of sexual relationships without physical sexual expression. The success of these celibate communities in maintaining stable, fulfilling relationships over long periods demonstrates that medieval people had sophisticated understanding of the various components of intimate relationships and could create alternative forms of intimacy when sexual expression wasn't appropriate or desired. These religious communities served as laboratories for exploring different ways of organizing human relationships that influence broader social understanding of intimacy and connection. Medieval mystical traditions also developed elaborate frameworks for understanding the relationship between human sexuality and spiritual experience. These traditions often used sexual imagery and metaphors to describe spiritual union with the divine, suggesting that medieval religious thinkers saw sexuality and spirituality as related rather than opposed forces in human life. This integration of sexual and spiritual understanding created rich theological traditions that influenced both religious practice and popular culture. The medieval period's approach to sexuality ultimately reveals a culture that was far more sophisticated, practical, and humane in its understanding of human sexual needs than stereotypes suggest. Rather than being uniformly repressive or ignorant, medieval society developed comprehensive systems for managing sexuality that balanced individual desires with social needs, religious values with practical necessities, and moral ideals with human realities. Medieval people understood that sexuality was a fundamental aspect of human experience that required careful attention and wise management, rather than simple suppression or indulgence. Their approaches to sexual education, healthcare, relationship guidance, and social regulation demonstrate remarkable insight into the complexity of human sexuality and the challenges of creating social systems that honor both individual autonomy and collective well-being. The legacy of medieval sexuality continues to influence contemporary approaches to sexual health, education, and regulation in ways that are often unrecognized. Many of the fundamental insights about human sexuality that were developed during the medieval period remain relevant for addressing contemporary sexual issues and challenges. Their pragmatic approaches to balancing competing values and interests offer valuable models for contemporary societies grappling with similar challenges in managing human sexuality within complex social frameworks. As we continue to develop our understanding of human sexuality and create systems for supporting healthy sexual relationships, the medieval period's comprehensive approaches to sexual well-being provide important historical perspective on the ongoing human project of understanding and expressing sexuality in socially constructive ways. Their recognition of sexuality as an integral part of human flourishing, rather than simply a biological urge or moral problem, offers frameworks for thinking about sexual health and relationships that remain valuable today. The medieval period's willingness to acknowledge complexity and nuance in sexual matters, combined with their emphasis on practical wisdom over rigid moral rules, provides models for addressing sexual issues that honor both individual needs and social responsibilities. Their understanding that sexual relationships require ongoing attention, communication, and adaptation offers insights that remain relevant for anyone seeking to create and maintain healthy, intimate relationships, regardless of the historical period or social context in which they live. Medieval attitudes toward nudity and bodily shame reveal yet another layer of complexity that challenges our assumptions about their supposed prudishness. Unlike the Victorian era that would follow centuries later, medieval people had a surprisingly relaxed relationship with the human body that was shaped by practical necessities rather than moral anxieties. Public bathing was common in many medieval cities, with bathhouses serving not just as places for hygiene, but as important social centers where business was conducted, friendships were formed, and community bonds were strengthened. These public baths weren't segregated by gender in the way we might expect from a supposedly modest era. Men and women often bathed together in large communal pools, and contemporary illustrations show people of all ages socializing casually while nude or partially clothed. The atmosphere was more like a modern spa or social club than the shame-filled environment that stereotypes might suggest. Bathing was seen as beneficial for health, necessary for cleanliness, and enjoyable for its own sake, without the moral complications that later periods would attach to communal nudity. Medieval medical practice also required a comfort with nudity that would seem remarkable by later standards. Physicians regularly examined patients' entire bodies, regardless of gender, and medical texts included detailed anatomical illustrations that showed nude figures, without any sense of embarrassment or impropriety. Medical examination was understood as a professional necessity that transcended normal social conventions about modesty, and patients were expected to cooperate fully with physical examinations that might involve intimate touching or exposure. The medieval art of the period also reveals attitudes toward the human body that were far more accepting than later moral frameworks would allow. Religious art frequently depicted nude figures, from Adam and Eve to various saints and martyrs, without any sense that the human body was inherently shameful or sinful. Secular art was even more explicit, with nude figures appearing in manuscripts, sculptures, and decorative arts that were displayed publicly without controversy or scandal. Medieval clothing practices also reflected practical attitudes toward the body that prioritized function over modesty. Undergarments were minimal or non-existent for most people, and clothing was often designed for easy removal when necessary for work, bathing, or medical care. The elaborate systems of underclothing that would characterize later periods were unknown in medieval society, where practicality took precedence over concealment or shame about the human form. The medieval understanding of the body as God's creation also influenced attitudes toward nudity and physical appearance. Rather than seeing the human body as inherently sinful or shameful, medieval theology generally portrayed the body as a divine creation that deserved respect and care. This theological framework created space for appreciating physical beauty and accepting nudity in appropriate contexts, without the moral anxiety that would characterize later periods. Medieval marriage customs often included traditions that explicitly celebrated the physical aspects of the relationship between husband and wife. Wedding night customs in many communities involved public acknowledgement of the couple's sexual union, with friends and family, participating in rituals that blessed and celebrated the physical consummation of the marriage. These traditions weren't considered scandalous or inappropriate, but were understood as important social recognition of the couple's new status and relationship. The bedding ceremony, practiced in many medieval communities, involved the wedding guests escorting the newly married couple to their bedchamber, and sometimes even staying to witness the couple getting into bed together. While this might seem intrusive by modern standards, it served important social functions in establishing the legitimacy of the marriage and ensuring that the union was properly consummated. These ceremonies demonstrated community support for the marriage, while also providing social validation of the couple's sexual relationship. Medieval childbirth practices also involved communal participation and support that required comfort with bodily functions and intimate processes. Birth was typically attended by multiple women from the community who assisted with the delivery and provided emotional support for the mother. These birth attendants were familiar with the intimate details of pregnancy and childbirth, and they shared knowledge and techniques that were passed down through generations of women. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical appearance and sexual attraction. While they didn't have modern concepts of physical fitness or beauty standards, medieval people understood that physical appearance played important roles in romantic relationships and sexual desire. Medical texts often included advice about maintaining physical attractiveness, including recommendations for diet, exercise, and grooming that were designed to enhance sexual appeal. Medieval cosmetic practices were more elaborate than commonly assumed, with both men and women using various preparations to enhance their physical appearance. These cosmetics weren't seen as vanity or deception, but as appropriate attention to one's appearance that could contribute to social and romantic success. The use of perfumes, hair treatments, and skin preparations was common among those who could afford them, and the knowledge of how to prepare these cosmetics was passed down through families and communities. The medieval period also developed complex social codes around physical attraction and courtship behavior that acknowledged the importance of sexual desire while channeling it into socially acceptable forms. These codes allowed for considerable flirtation and romantic expression while maintaining appropriate boundaries that protected social stability and family honor. Young people learned elaborate systems of signals and romantic interest while maintaining PLD behaviors that allowed them to express forcible deniability if their advances were not welcomed. Medieval dance and music often included elements that were explicitly sexual or romantic, providing socially sanctioned opportunities for physical contact and emotional expression between potential romantic partners. These cultural activities weren't hidden or shameful, but were public celebrations of human attraction and desire that brought communities together while providing opportunities for courtship and relationship formation. The medieval period's integration of sexuality into various aspects of cultural and social life demonstrates their understanding that sexual desire was a natural and healthy part of human experience that needed to be acknowledged and accommodated, rather than suppressed or denied. Their approaches to managing sexuality within social frameworks created space for sexual expression while maintaining community cohesion and moral values, showing a sophisticated understanding of the balance between individual desires and social needs. Medieval approaches to aging and sexuality also reveal progressive attitudes that challenge stereotypes about their supposedly restrictive moral frameworks. Unlike some later periods that viewed sexuality as primarily the domain of young people, medieval culture recognized that sexual desire and activity could continue throughout life, and that older adults had the same rights to sexual expression as younger people. Medical texts discussed the sexual health needs of older adults and provided advice about maintaining sexual function and pleasure into advanced age. Medieval communities also developed systems for supporting older adults in maintaining intimate relationships, recognizing that companionship and physical affection remained important throughout life. Elderly couples were not expected to live as celibate companions, but were understood to have ongoing sexual needs that deserved accommodation and support. This attitude towards sexuality in later life reflects a mature understanding of human sexuality as a lifelong aspect of human experience rather than something that should be abandoned at a certain age. The medieval period's understanding of disability and sexuality was also more nuanced than might be expected. Medical texts acknowledged that people with physical limitations might need adaptations or accommodations to maintain sexual relationships, and they provided practical advice about how to address these challenges. Rather than assuming that disability precluded sexual activity, medieval physicians developed techniques and recommendations that allowed people with various physical limitations to maintain satisfying intimate relationships. Medieval legal systems also recognized the sexual rights of people with disabilities, providing protections against sexual exploitation while affirming their rights to consensual sexual relationships. These legal frameworks acknowledged that people with mental or physical limitations might be more vulnerable to sexual abuse while still recognizing their fundamental rights to intimate relationships and sexual expression when appropriate safeguards were in place. The medieval period also developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to sexual diversity and individual differences in sexual behavior. While they didn't have modern concepts of sexual orientation or gender identity, medieval people recognized that individuals varied considerably in their sexual interests, desires, and behaviors. Rather than attempting to force everyone into identical patterns of sexual expression, medieval communities often found ways to accommodate different approaches to sexuality within acceptable social frameworks. This accommodation of sexual diversity was often informal and discreet, but it allowed people whose sexuality didn't conform to standard patterns to find ways of expressing their desires and forming intimate relationships that met their needs while maintaining social acceptability. These arrangements required considerable social skill and community tolerance, but they demonstrate that medieval society was capable of flexibility and accommodation in addressing human sexual diversity. Medieval religious communities also developed alternative forms of intimate relationships that provided emotional and spiritual satisfaction for people who chose celibate lifestyles. These relationships often included elements of romantic love, deep friendship, and spiritual partnership that provided many of the benefits of sexual relationships without physical sexual expression. The success of these alternative forms of intimacy demonstrates that medieval people understood the various components of intimate relationships and could create satisfying alternatives to conventional sexual partnerships when circumstances required. The medieval period's approach to sexual education and guidance also evolved throughout the era, becoming increasingly sophisticated and comprehensive as communities gained experience with different approaches to managing sexuality. Early medieval approaches to sexual education were often limited and focused primarily on basic moral instruction, But later, medieval communities developed more detailed and practical approaches that provided young people with the knowledge and skills they needed for successful sexual relationships. These educational approaches often combined formal religious instruction with informal mentorship relationships that provided practical guidance about sexual behavior, relationship management, and family planning. The goal was not simply to prevent sexual misconduct, but to prepare young people for fulfilling intimate relationships that would contribute to their personal happiness and social stability. Medieval communities also developed systems for ongoing education and support for married couples, recognizing that successful sexual relationships required continued learning and adaptation throughout marriage. These support systems often involved networks of experienced couples who served as mentors and advisors for younger married people, providing guidance about managing sexual relationships over long periods and adapting to changing circumstances and needs. The medieval period's recognition that sexual relationships required ongoing attention and skill development led to increasingly sophisticated approaches to relationship maintenance and improvement. Rather than assuming that couples would naturally develop successful sexual relationships without guidance or support, medieval communities provided resources and assistance that helped couples work through difficulties and maintain satisfying intimate relationships over time. Medieval approaches to sexual conflict resolution were also remarkably advanced, with detailed procedures for addressing sexual disputes and problems within marriages and other intimate relationships. These procedures often involved multiple levels of intervention, from informal community mediation to formal religious or legal proceedings, depending on the severity of the problems and the willingness of the parties to work toward resolution. The medieval period's comprehensive approaches to sexuality ultimately created social systems that acknowledged the complexity and importance of sexual relationships, while providing practical support for managing sexuality in ways that contributed to both individual fulfillment and social stability. Their recognition that sexuality was a fundamental aspect of human experience that required careful attention and wise management led to innovations in sexual healthcare, relationship guidance, and social regulation that influenced the development of later approaches to human sexuality. The medieval period's legacy in human sexuality extends far beyond their specific practices and beliefs to include fundamental insights about the nature of human sexual relationships and the challenges of creating social systems that honor both individual desires and collective needs. Their pragmatic approaches to balancing competing values and interests, combined with their recognition of the complexity and diversity of human sexuality, provide valuable models for contemporary societies facing similar challenges in managing human sexuality within complex social frameworks. Medieval people understood that sexuality was neither simply a biological urge that could be easily controlled through moral rules, nor a purely individual matter that could be left entirely to personal choice. Instead, they recognized sexuality as a complex phenomenon that required careful consideration of physical, emotional, spiritual, and social factors, and they developed comprehensive approaches to sexual regulation and support that attempted to address all these dimensions of human sexual experience. The medieval period's willingness to acknowledge the reality of human sexual desire while working to channel it into socially constructive forms demonstrates a mature understanding of human nature that remains relevant for contemporary discussions about sexual ethics and regulation. Their recognition that rigid moral rules could sometimes produce harmful results led them to develop flexible approaches that emphasized practical wisdom and individual circumstances rather than inflexible adherence to abstract principles. As we continue to grapple with questions about human sexuality in contemporary society, the medieval period's comprehensive approaches to sexual health, education, and regulation offer valuable perspectives on the ongoing human project of understanding and managing sexuality in ways that honor both individual autonomy and social responsibility. Their insights about the relationship between sexuality and human flourishing provide frameworks for thinking about sexual relationships that remain relevant for anyone seeking to create and maintain healthy, intimate relationships in any historical period or social context. The medieval understanding of sexuality as an integral part of human experience that deserved careful attention and wise management, rather than simple suppression or indulgence, offers important lessons for contemporary approaches to sexual education, healthcare, and social policy. Their recognition that successful sexual relationships required ongoing learning, communication, and adaptation provides insights that remain valuable for individuals and communities seeking to create supportive environments for healthy, intimate relationships. The medieval period's sophisticated approaches to managing the intersection between individual desires and social needs in sexual matters demonstrate that it is possible to create social systems that acknowledge and accommodate human sexuality while maintaining community cohesion and moral values. Their creative solutions to the challenges of human sexuality provide inspiration for contemporary efforts to address similar challenges in different social and cultural contexts. Medieval society's ultimate recognition that human sexuality was too complex and important to be left to simple moral prohibitions or individual choice alone led them to develop comprehensive systems of support, guidance, and regulation that attempted to honor all aspects of human sexual experience. Their legacy in this area continues to influence contemporary approaches to sexuality and intimate relationships, providing valuable historical perspective on the ongoing human project of understanding and expressing sexuality in socially constructive ways. The medieval period's understanding of sexuality as a lifelong journey rather than a destination reveals perhaps their most sophisticated insight into human nature. They recognized that sexual relationships weren't static arrangements that could be established once and then forgotten, but dynamic partnerships that required constant attention, adaptation, and renewal. This understanding led to the development of what we might recognize today as relationship maintenance practices that were remarkably advanced for their time. Medieval couples were encouraged to regularly reassess and refresh their intimate relationships, not just when problems arose, but as ongoing practice throughout their marriages. This might involve seasonal rituals that renewed their commitment to each other, periodic discussions about their sexual satisfaction and desires, or consultation with experienced advisors who could provide guidance about maintaining intimacy over long periods. These practices were based on the understanding that successful relationships required active effort from both partners rather than passive acceptance of whatever developed naturally. The medieval period also developed increasingly nuanced understanding of the relationship between sexual satisfaction and broader life satisfaction. They recognized that couples who were happy in their intimate relationships were more likely to be successful in other areas of life, including work, parenting, and community involvement. This understanding led to approaches to sexual counseling that considered the broader context of couples' lives, rather than focusing narrowly on sexual techniques or problems in isolation. Medieval physicians and counselors understood that sexual problems often reflected broader relationship issues or life stresses, and they developed comprehensive approaches to treatment that addressed all these factors together. A couple experiencing sexual difficulties might receive guidance about communication skills, stress management, work-life balance, and family relationships, alongside more specific advice about sexual technique or medical treatment. This holistic approach to sexual health recognized the interconnected nature of all aspects of human experience and the need to address sexual problems within their broader context. The medieval period's approach to sexual pleasure also evolved considerably throughout the era, becoming increasingly sophisticated and explicit in acknowledging the importance of mutual satisfaction. Later, medieval texts were remarkably frank in their discussions of sexual technique, providing detailed guidance about how to ensure that both partners achieved satisfaction during intimate encounters. These discussions weren't presented as indulgent or morally questionable, but as practical necessities for maintaining healthy relationships and preventing the medical problems that could result from sexual dissatisfaction. Medieval understanding of the relationship between emotional intimacy and sexual satisfaction became increasingly refined throughout the period. They recognized that couples who maintained strong emotional connections were more likely to have satisfying sexual relationships, while those who experienced emotional distance often struggled with sexual problems as well. This understanding led to counseling approaches that emphasized the importance of ongoing communication, shared activities, and emotional support in maintaining both sexual and overall relationship satisfaction. The medieval period also developed sophisticated approaches to managing sexual desire during difficult life circumstances, such as illness, pregnancy, travel, or financial stress. Rather than simply advising couples to suppress their desires during challenging periods, medieval counselors provided practical guidance about how to maintain intimacy and connection even when normal sexual activity wasn't possible or advisable. These approaches often involved alternative forms of physical intimacy, emotional connection practices, and communication strategies that could help couples maintain their bond during temporary separations or difficulties. Medieval communities also recognized the importance of privacy and discretion in sexual relationships, developing social norms that protected couples' intimate lives while still providing necessary support and guidance. These norms created boundaries between public and private aspects of sexual relationships that allowed couples to maintain dignity and autonomy while still accessing community resources when needed. The balance between community involvement and personal privacy in sexual matters was carefully maintained through social conventions that respected individual autonomy while acknowledging the community's legitimate interest in supporting successful relationships. The medieval period's understanding of sexual communication was also remarkably advanced, with detailed guidance about how couples could discuss intimate matters in ways that enhanced rather than damaged their relationships. Medieval counselors understood that many sexual problems stemmed from poor communication between partners, and they developed specific techniques for helping couples learn to talk about their desires, concerns, and needs in constructive ways. These communication strategies often involved structured approaches to difficult conversations, techniques for managing conflict and disagreement, and methods for maintaining respect and affection even when discussing sensitive topics. Medieval approaches to sexual timing and rhythm were also sophisticated, recognizing that successful, intimate relationships required attention to natural cycles and rhythms in desire and energy. They understood that both individual and relationship sexuality had natural fluctuations that needed to be acknowledged and accommodated rather than forced into artificial patterns. This understanding led to guidance about how couples could synchronize their intimate lives with their natural rhythms and life circumstances in ways that enhanced rather than constrained their sexual satisfaction. The medieval period also developed increasingly complex understanding of the relationship between sexual creativity and relationship satisfaction. They recognized that couples who maintained variety and novelty in their intimate relationships were more likely to sustain satisfaction over long periods, and they provided guidance about how to introduce appropriate innovation while remaining within acceptable moral boundaries. This advice often focused on emotional and communicative aspects of sexual creativity rather than just physical techniques, recognizing that mental and emotional engagement were just as important as physical satisfaction. Medieval understanding of sexual healing and recovery from sexual trauma or dysfunction was also remarkably advanced for its time. They recognized that sexual problems could result from past experiences, current stresses, or relationship difficulties, and they developed comprehensive approaches to healing that addressed both immediate symptoms and underlying causes. These healing approaches often involved combinations of medical treatment, counseling, spiritual guidance, and community support that provided multiple pathways to recovery and restoration of healthy sexual function. The medieval period's approach to sexual mentorship and guidance created systems where experienced couples could share their knowledge and wisdom with younger people in ways that were both practical and appropriate. These mentorship relationships often lasted for years or even decades, providing ongoing support and guidance as couples navigated different phases of their relationships and encountered new challenges or opportunities. The wisdom gained through these mentorship systems was passed down through generations, creating accumulated knowledge about successful intimate relationships that benefited entire communities. Medieval communities also developed sophisticated approaches to managing sexual jealousy and possessiveness within relationships. They recognized that these emotions were natural but potentially destructive if not properly managed, and they provided guidance about how couples could address jealousy and possessiveness in ways that strengthened rather than damaged their relationships. This guidance often involved techniques for building trust, improving communication, addressing underlying insecurities, and creating relationship structures that minimized opportunities for jealousy while maximizing opportunities for connection and satisfaction. The medieval period's understanding of sexual generosity and reciprocity in intimate relationships was also highly developed. They emphasized the importance of both partners being attentive to each other's needs and desires, not just as a moral obligation, but as a practical necessity for maintaining satisfying long-term relationships. This understanding led to specific guidance about how couples could cultivate attitudes of generosity and service toward each other that enhance their intimate connection, while avoiding patterns of selfishness or exploitation that could damage their relationship. Medieval approaches to sexual celebration and appreciation within relationships created frameworks for acknowledging and honoring the positive aspects of intimate partnerships. These approaches often involved regular expressions of gratitude, appreciation, and joy about sexual relationships that reinforced their value and importance in couples' lives. The celebration of sexual relationships wasn't considered immodest or inappropriate, but was understood as necessary recognition of one of life's most important sources of happiness and connection. The medieval period also developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of sexual adaptation and accommodation within relationships. They recognized that successful long-term relationships required ongoing adaptation to changing circumstances, including aging, illness, life stress, and evolving desires. Rather than expecting relationships to remain static, medieval counselors provided guidance about how couples could adapt their intimate lives to changing circumstances while maintaining connection and satisfaction. Medieval understanding of the relationship between sexual health and spiritual development was complex and often paradoxical. While official religious doctrines sometimes portrayed sexuality as potentially problematic for spiritual growth, many medieval thinkers also recognized that healthy sexual relationships could contribute to spiritual development by teaching important lessons about love, service, connection, and transcendence. This understanding led to approaches to sexuality that integrated physical and spiritual dimensions, rather than treating them as competing or contradictory aspects of human experience. The medieval period's approach to sexual education within relationships recognized that learning about sexuality was an ongoing process that continued throughout marriage rather than ending with the wedding ceremony. Couples were encouraged to continue learning about each other's needs and desires, experimenting with new approaches to intimacy, and seeking guidance when they encountered challenges or wanted to enhance their relationships. This approach to ongoing sexual education created relationships that could grow and develop over time, rather than becoming stagnant or routine. Medieval communities also developed sophisticated systems for supporting couples through sexual difficulties without violating their privacy or dignity. These support systems often involved trusted advisors who could provide confidential guidance, community resources that could address practical problems, and social networks that could offer emotional support during challenging periods. The balance between providing help and respecting privacy was carefully maintained through social conventions that protected couples' autonomy while ensuring that necessary support was available when needed. The medieval period's recognition of sexuality as both intensely personal and inherently social led to approaches to sexual regulation and support that acknowledged both individual autonomy and community interest. They understood that sexual relationships had implications beyond the immediate participants, and that communities had legitimate interests in supporting successful intimate relationships while respecting individual privacy and choice. This balance between individual rights and social interests was maintained through complex systems of norms, laws, and customs that provided frameworks for sexual behavior while preserving space for personal expression and choice. Medieval understanding of sexual wisdom and maturity recognized that developing healthy approaches to sexuality required experience, reflection, and ongoing growth throughout life. They understood that sexual maturity involved not just knowledge of techniques or facts, but also emotional intelligence, communication skills, empathy, and wisdom about human nature and relationships. This understanding led to approaches to sexual development that emphasized character formation and personal growth alongside practical education about sexual behavior and health. The medieval period ultimately developed comprehensive approaches to human sexuality that recognized its complexity, importance, and central role in human flourishing. Their insights about the relationship between sexuality and overall life satisfaction, the importance of communication and emotional connection in intimate relationships, and the need for ongoing attention and adaptation in sexual partnerships remain relevant for contemporary understanding of human sexuality and intimate relationships. Medieval people understood that sexuality was neither a simple biological function that could be easily managed through rules and regulations, nor a purely individual matter that could be left entirely to personal choice. Instead, they recognized sexuality as a complex aspect of human experience that required careful attention, wise guidance, and supportive communities to flourish in ways that contributed to both individual happiness and social stability. Their approaches to managing this complexity offer valuable lessons for contemporary societies facing similar challenges in creating frameworks for human sexuality that honor both individual autonomy and collective well-being. The medieval period's legacy in human sexuality extends far beyond their specific practices and beliefs to include fundamental insights about human nature, relationships, and the conditions necessary for sexual flourishing. Their recognition that successful sexual relationships required ongoing attention, communication, adaptation, and community support provides frameworks for understanding intimate relationships that remain valuable for anyone seeking to create and maintain healthy sexual partnerships in any historical period or cultural context. As we've journeyed through the surprisingly sophisticated landscape of medieval sexuality, one thing becomes abundantly clear. These weren't the sexually repressed, ignorant people that popular culture has painted them to be. They were human beings navigating the same fundamental desires, challenges, and needs that we face today, but with different tools, different frameworks, and different social structures. They developed remarkably nuanced approaches to sexuality that balanced religious ideals with human realities, individual desires with social needs, and moral principles with practical necessities. The medieval world understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern age, that sexuality isn't just about individual pleasure or even romantic love. It's about the fabric that holds communities together, the force that creates families, the energy that drives human connection and continuation. They developed systems for managing this powerful force that were both respectful of its importance and realistic about its challenges. Their approaches weren't perfect, and they certainly reflected the inequalities and limitations of their time. But they also demonstrated a wisdom about human nature that we can still learn from today. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people understood that sexuality was too complex and important to be left to simple rules or individual choice alone. They recognized that healthy sexual relationships required support, guidance, education, and community involvement, while still respecting the intimate and personal nature of sexual experience. This balance between social involvement and personal autonomy, between moral guidance and individual freedom, between spiritual ideals and physical realities, created frameworks for managing human sexuality that were both practical and profound. Their story reminds us that human sexuality has always been complex, that people have always found creative ways to navigate the challenges of intimate relationships, and that the fundamental questions about how to balance individual desires with social needs, how to maintain healthy relationships over time, and how to integrate sexuality into a meaningful life are timeless human concerns that transcend any particular historical period or cultural context. So the next time someone tells you that people in the past were sexually repressed or ignorant, you can smile and remember the medieval couples who received detailed medical advice about mutual pleasure, the communities that celebrated sexuality within appropriate frameworks, and the physicians who prescribed masturbation as legitimate medical treatment. The past, as always, is far more interesting, complex, and human than our stereotypes suggest. And in understanding that complexity, we better understand ourselves and the ongoing human project of learning to love, connect, and flourish together in this strange and wonderful world. So there you have it. Medieval sexuality in all its messy, complicated, surprisingly sophisticated glory. Far from the prudish, ignorant peasants we imagine them to be, these people were navigating human desire with medical knowledge, legal frameworks, and social systems that would make our modern approaches look simplistic by comparison. They understood that sex wasn't just about procreation or sin, but about health, relationships, and the fundamental human need for connection and pleasure. Their solutions weren't perfect, but they were human, practical, and often remarkably wise. Sweet dreams. And remember, the past is always more interesting than the stereotypes suggest.